Alright, so today I'm going to make a coffee recipe from Germany for the first time called
Pharisee Coffee.
Or in English, Pharisee Coffee. It's kind of similar to Irish coffee, which I absolutely love. The main difference here is that instead of using whiskey like Irish coffee, we're going to use dark Jamaican rum. For some of you, this video might be a bit of a curveball because in order to understand the history, heritage, and even the name of this drink, we're going to have to talk a bit about coffee, rum, and theology. Let's mix it up. Alright, so I don't really know a lot about the history of this drink. I myself am neither German, have German heritage, or even know a German person. To be honest, I found this recipe while scouring the internet looking for interesting video topics. But the little bit of particular history I did gather was that the whole idea behind this drink is very much like that of the Austrian Einspanner, in that whipped cream is placed on top of the coffee to keep it from spilling. However, unlike the Einspanner, the whipped cream on Pharisee coffee is not there to keep the liquid of the coffee from spilling, but to keep the smell of Jamaican rum from spilling out of the cup. Which of course leads one to ask why the flip you wouldn't want to smell the wonderful aroma of coffee and rum. But that in turn leads us to the name of the drink. Pharisee Coffee. And this is the part of the history that I actually do know quite well because it is not German history or coffee history, but Christian history, which is incredibly interesting in how it relates to the name and the reason for the name of this particular Germanic libation. You see, in the 1st century AD, there was a Jewish sect that conflicted strongly with the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, and ultimately were the political party directly responsible for his death. These people were the Pharisees. Not only did they fight ideologically with Jesus himself during his time on earth, but they also violently oppressed his followers after his ascension, including the seizure of property, imprisonment, and even death. Part of what made the Pharisee agenda so incompatible with Jesus and his teachings can be seen in a quote from Jesus himself. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You pay a tenth of mint, dill, and cumin, yet you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faith. These things should have been done without neglecting the others. Blind guides, you strain out a gnat, yet gulp down a camel." Pretty intense for a guy largely portrayed in the popular Western ethos as a long-haired, mild-mannered, anti-judgment, woke social justice warrior. But I digress. Did you catch the point there? Jesus criticized the Pharisees for being overly concerned about avoiding even the smallest infraction of the Mosaic law at the expense of violating the most important and consequential commands of that same law. And here's a practical example you probably will struggle to believe. The law of Moses commanded that no regular work could be done on Saturdays because it was a day of rest. To avoid transgressing this law, the Pharisees extrapolated this down to everything, even the smallest of situations. Take the act of throwing a stone in the air and catching it again. If you caught it with the same hand, that was not work. But if you caught it with the other hand, that qualified as work. And mind you, those convicted of violating the day of rest could be stoned to death. And so, when Jesus repeatedly performed miraculous healings on Sabbath days, rather than rejoicing that the words of the prophet, "The blind shall see, the lame shall walk, and the dead shall be raised," were being fulfilled right in front of them, and therefore Jesus was the long-awaited Messiah, they conspired to murder him. So over the centuries, as a result, the word Pharisee, for Christians at least, came to refer to anyone who cares more about the appearance of righteousness, especially through adherence to man-made rules, rather than genuine righteousness through faith in Jesus Christ. And one of the very contentious issues of the last few hundred years or so has been alcohol consumption. Does the Bible teach alcohol consumption as acceptable or sinful? Or is that a man-made rule? Are you really a Christian if you think the answer is yes? Or maybe it's no? Clearly, you can see that the inventors and imbibers of Pharisee coffee didn't mean that it was coffee for Pharisees or those who refused to drink, but as a tongue-in-cheek name meaning that it won't offend any nearby Pharisees, the whipped cream concealing the alcohol in their coffee right under the Pharisees' noses, as it were. Which I have to admit is freaking hilarious. Okay, so I've got everything prepped. Time to put this together. I've got a double shot of espresso, ounce and a half of rum, some brown sugar cubes we'll use to sweeten the coffee, and some freshly made whipped cream. This is not super stiff, just on the edge of being stiff peaks. So you can see it's not pouring out. A lot of times for Irish coffee, I like to go a little bit softer than this, but I think this consistency will be perfect for the Pharisee coffee, and I'll tell you why a little bit later. All right, to assemble. Let's move these out of the way. All right, so I preheated this glass, and this is typically something I would use more for an old-fashioned, but I don't really have have the proper German, like tall porcelain coffee cup. I don't have one of those, and I didn't want to do it in an Irish coffee mug, and I thought, you know what? This is gonna look pretty cool. So let's do this. So we want 2 brown sugar cubes. 1, 2, and then we'll pour the coffee over. So we'll soak those bad boys with that. I'm gonna add the rum. There we go. And then I'm gonna take my muddler and I'm gonna break up these sugar cubes. Let's see. Yeah, they kind of want to break already. There we go. All right, and I'm gonna add some more hot water. Rinse all the sugar off of the muddler. I'm gonna top it about there. So I'm gonna stir to combine all of this. It smells incredible already. It looks like most of the sugar is dissolved. So now, and this is what makes the Pharisee coffee so unique, we're gonna top it with this super thick layer of foam, and you won't be able to smell the rum anymore after that. Let's see here. Perfect. Get all the way out the edges. Ooh. Well, that looks delicious. All right. And then we're gonna get a little cocoa powder on it. So it's been a while since I recorded the original video, and somehow, I'm still not quite sure how, the tasting video file got corrupted. So here we are. New studio, new space. This is quite a while later, but I still have some Pharisee coffee. Freshly made, exact same rum, same sugar, different coffee. I don't even remember what I used for the original one. So let's add the whipped cream. I think this is a little bit thicker than I did last time. Whoa, that is a thick boy, good grief. Oh yeah, I whipped it. Not to needlessly make you guys wait longer, but before I do the tasting notes, I'm gonna turn it over to the other version of me on my theology channel, because as some of you probably don't know, that's a thing I do. But hurry back. This is awesome. All right, should Christians drink alcohol or not? Is it sinful? Is it acceptable? What do we do here? Before we get into the nitty-gritty, let me briefly just say that if someone has a personal conviction that they ought not to drink alcohol, well then you shouldn't drink alcohol. And the New Testament has a lot to say about that. If you personally find it to be destructive or find it to be unhelpful for your life, or just in your conscience believe that you personally shouldn't do it, then the scripture says that if you do that action or partake of that thing, it is sinful. If your conscience is telling you, I shouldn't drink alcohol, don't drink alcohol. The question here is actually less of prescription, should you drink alcohol, should I drink alcohol, but rather one of inherent sinfulness. Is it intrinsically wrong to ingest alcohol? Is it sinful? Does it harm your body in a spiritual way? That's the question. I really think it's a very, very simple question to answer. The reason why it's so contentious and has so much just lasting controversy has to do with ignorance. I think there's really 2 things that people don't know and don't understand, and that's why there's still this contention over the question of whether or not it's actually even acceptable for a Christian to drink alcohol. And I'll tell you up front, those 2 things are a quote from Jesus and the nature of yeast. So first of all, this quote from Jesus, he got in an argument with the Pharisees. They were criticizing his disciples because they weren't fasting at the time that the Pharisees thought they should be. And Jesus said to them, you know, John the Baptist came to you, neither eating or drinking, going to banquets or imbibing in alcohol, and you said he had a demon. But the Son of Man, that's Jesus, that's how he referred to himself, came to you eating and drinking, and you say he's a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is proved by all her children. Right? And that last part is just, it's a great saying. You should just add it to your repertoire, even if you're not a Christian. Wisdom is proved by all of her children. But coming back to the beginning, so you have these 2 polar opposite examples. You have a man who doesn't drink and a man who clearly does drink because he's being called a drunkard. And you don't call an obvious teetotaler a drunkard, right? So at the bare minimum, the Pharisees thought that he drank alcohol. That's why they call him a drunkard. So from their perspective, doesn't drink alcohol, does drink alcohol.
It's important that we pause here and note that when Jesus says he came eating and drinking, he's not saying that you Pharisees believe that I came eating and drinking, but is actively stating that he did in fact come eating and drinking, meaning drinking alcohol. And his differentiation between John the Baptist, a man born under a Nazirite vow who never touched any kind of alcohol, as a man who came neither eating or drinking, while he, Jesus, was a man who who did come eating and drinking is a plain, ironclad statement of the reality that Jesus did willingly and knowingly ingest alcohol. And it is equally clear from the language that Jesus treated the accusation of him being a drunkard as being equal to that of John the Baptist being demon-possessed. Jesus goes on to confirm that John the Baptist was not only not demon-possessed, but was the long-awaited for prophet who would be anointed with the spirit of the Old Testament prophet Elijah. Jesus could hardly confirm that John the Baptist was the Elijah who was to come, while simultaneously agreeing that he was demon-possessed. And Jesus treats such an accusation against John the Baptist as equal to an accusation that he, Jesus, was a drunkard.
And you're both condemning them, one as a worthless individual and the other is actually demon-possessed. And Jesus is saying, basically, you're disingenuous and you don't even believe what you're saying. There's no moral consistency or ethics underpinning your claims. You just don't like either one of us, and that's your sort of axe that you've chosen to grind with us. And what's really interesting is that Jesus doesn't correct their assertion that he's a drunkard. He doesn't say, I'm not a drunkard, I don't even drink. Come on, guys. He doesn't even deal with that. His issue is over the intrinsic value of alcohol. You're intrinsically saying that if I don't drink, there's something wrong with me, but that if I do drink, there's something wrong with me. So clearly that's not a legitimate complaint. The way that this becomes a controversy in the modern era, and this really wasn't an issue throughout the history of the church, it's only in the last, 150, maybe 200 or so years that it's really been a question, is it right or is it wrong for a Christian to partake of alcohol? That comes to the second thing people are ignorant of, and that's the nature of yeast. So the thing about grapes is that the moment you crush them, they start making alcohol, because all you need for alcohol is healthy yeast with access to sugar. Well, grapes naturally have a lot of yeast on the outside, and there's actually a lot of fruits that do that. I mean, apples, strawberries, lots of things are going to have naturally occurring yeast. Let's just deal with grapes. That's kind of the main thing that we make wine out of. The moment you start crushing them, that yeast starts turning the sugar into alcohol and carbon dioxide, the moment it happens. And the only way that you can really prevent that at all is through modern chemical means. That's how we get grape juice. The controversy comes about when people say that there's no difference between the word for grape juice and wine in the New Testament. There isn't a difference, they're the same word, and that's because grape juice didn't exist. There was new wine that had begun fermenting, but still had alcohol in it, just a low level. It doesn't necessarily have a great flavor to it from the perspective of someone who enjoys wine, but it does have alcohol. And then there's old wine that is fully fermented. And there's even a part in the scripture where Jesus talks about responding appropriately to situations, to what's going on around you. And he says, you don't put new wine into old wineskins. Why? Because new wine is fermenting. It's creating carbon dioxide. It's creating pressure. And he says, if you do that, you will burst the wineskin. Right? You put new wine into new wineskins so that that new, fresh material can handle the pressure that's created by that young wine that's fermenting. So the reason there isn't a difference is because there literally isn't a difference. There isn't such a thing as grape juice. That's why they didn't have a word for it. It didn't exist. So therefore we can say the only way that Jesus would be able to avoid drinking alcohol is if he took a Nazirite vow, preventing him from partaking of the fruit of the vine, right? And that actually is a teetotaler vow. It's a little bit obscure, but it's in the scripture. It's a vow to not drink alcohol. And the way that you wouldn't drink alcohol is you don't partake of any of the fruit of the vine. You don't drink grape juice, new wine, because all of it has alcohol in it. All of it has alcohol. From the moment you crush those grapes, it starts making alcohol instantly. Now, it's not an easily measurable amount of alcohol, but if the question is one of intrinsic value, is alcohol evil or is it acceptable? Obviously, anybody who's been well-trained in the Christian tradition and the Christian faith knows that you can take a good thing and make it bad by putting it in the wrong context, just like it's appropriate to punch someone in the face if they are harming a child, but you don't just walk up to a random stranger and punch them in the face. I think this can be summed up by saying to any Christian who is prescribing to others that you cannot drink alcohol, that it's intrinsically evil, Jesus didn't drink alcohol, all those kinds of things. I think a quote from Jesus is a perfect response to that. When he was arguing with the Sadducees over the nature of resurrection and whether resurrection from the dead is even a thing, he told them, you are in error because you know neither the scriptures or the power of God. And I think that's a great way to sum this up. If you think that it's wrong for Christians to drink alcohol, full stop, intrinsically, alcohol is evil, no one should ever drink it, you are in error because you do not know the scriptures or the power of yeast. Wow. Oh, that's so good.
Okay, so if you're anything like me, when you have hot coffee with booze and whipped cream, your mind instantly goes to Irish coffee. And that's a pretty fair analog for this drink. Although, this is a very, very different experience if you really get into the tasting. Whoa, dude. That's so good. Instead of having that sort of buttery, biscuity, Biscoff kind of shortbread cookie flavor of a Irish whiskey, here we have that rich molasses, burnt sugar kind of flavor from the Jamaican rum. Now, of course, that's gonna change depending upon the exact rum that you're using. And I have a couple different rums up here that would be fantastic in this drink. I have found that people are not always the biggest fan of Myers, but I think in the right application, and this is the right application, it's perfect. It's got a great flavor to work with the espresso. It's got such a strong flavor, but when served with the coffee, it doesn't push the coffee around, but it stands up to it, you know? It's a very different experience from an Irish coffee. This is so much more rich and robust. It's if I could use sort of musical terms to describe the flavor, this is all kind of bass, baritone, rich, kind of in that realm, whereas Irish coffee tends to be a lot more on the treble side of things. It's bright, brassy, kind of in your face, and that's sort of the difference between these drinks. Oh, that whipped cream with a little salt in it. So good, and it doesn't need to be sweet. There's plenty of sweetness from the espresso and the sugar cubes in there. This is a real treat. And it's actually incredible the amount of alcohol smell that you get from the rum when you put it in there with the hot coffee at first. It is very noticeable. It's only 1.5 ounces of rum. That's less than you would normally have in a cocktail, but because it's hot, it just smacks you in the face with that flavor. You put the whipped cream on top of it, and man, it smells like nothing. Like there's no odor coming off of this drink at all. I mean, if I get my nose right in there, it just smells like milk fat, which, you know, doesn't have a whole lot of a smell to it. That is so freaking good. Now, after talking through all of the theological implications and the tasting notes, would I take this to church? No, I'm not an alcoholic. Despite how my brothers love to tease me, I'm not actually an alcoholic. So this is not what I would want to take to church on a Sunday morning, and I wouldn't pregame with it before going either. But maybe I'd get more out of the average sermon if I was slightly lubricated ahead of time. Cheers.